Hello, I'm Dr. Tanya Riches. As the first plenary address of this conference, I guess this is an excellent time to welcome each other. Therefore, in a traditional Australian ceremonial moment called Acknowledgement of Country, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land I'm standing on today, the Wallumedegal peoples and their elders past and present. This clan for countless generations fished, danced and hunted here. I'd also like to pay my respects to any Indigenous peoples in attendance at this conference. This presentation has been somewhat challenging to write, if I'm honest. There's the ideal, and then there's 2020. Our conference was scheduled in Melbourne, which is soon to be Australia's largest city and boasts most of Australia's megachurches, following some recent campus plans. Therefore, global, local, and historic models coexist within short distances. Melbourne is also Australia's coffee and fashion capital, and what megachurch attendee does not like fashion or coffee? However, despite the best laid plans in the world, we are now meeting digitally and not with particularly impressive coffee or fashion. Nevertheless, this platform is safe, which is the main thing, and I hope that you and your family are safe in this pandemic situation. My point is, Melbourne was intentionally selected to challenge many binaries that exist regarding megachurches. Anthropologists have noted the appeal of binaries for humans to organise their world schematically. Therefore, it's unsurprising that the prevailing tendency is to juxtapose the Academy's rational, educated researcher against an emotional, uneducated and proportionally female megachurch attendee. Hopefully, this presentation will undo this familiar binary, as I am a researcher with a PhD working within a megachurch. As such, I live at the intersection of two institutions, the university and the church. Much scholarly interest concerns the megachurch as institution with its power centered within its structures and leaders. The same could be said, of course, for the university. However, in this current environment, the university, it seems, is no longer safe. In Australia, there have been various moves towards a precarious academic workforce. Therefore, hundreds, if not thousands of university-employed researchers have lost their jobs during this global pandemic, even as students are moved online with all the extra work that entails. The decision to defund the humanities while favouring more profitable or commercially acceptable degrees is a further blow to the sector. Therefore, universities and their staff are stretched in multiple ways. For many, this seems directly related to our Prime Minister, who, of course, attends a Pentecostal megachurch. But the megachurch too has been significantly affected by the pandemic. While smaller churches may gather in socially distanced formations, megachurches have pivoted to digital offerings. Therefore, at Hillsong, the newly appointed online campus pastor has received the entire church's attendance after the government shut down large meetings in March. But as we are gathered at this conference to discuss the rituals of the megachurch, but not the university, I will simply note that there is at times a profound similarity between the two organisations and the roles that they play in society. Both narrate our present world, and this can ignite a clash of powers. Therefore, I understand why a university researcher may ignore a megachurch attendee's perspective in preference of observing meso or macro level dynamics. I also understand why a megachurch attendee may choose to ignore the critique of a researcher as they prioritise their own experience of the microstructures and their different views on religious leadership. However, I'm not advocating for either such binary positions. Instead, I hope this plenary presents some ways forward. Megachurches within the literature are defined as having more than 2,000 attendees per week. Here, the Pentecostal preacher usually relates this to the thousands gathering in the biblical book of Acts. However, there is a need for a recognition that due to globalization, or the speeding up of our interconnectedness in time and space, the superstructure of global Christianity impacts upon our contemporary local context. Also, the technological advancements since the megachurch movement was popularized in the 1980s have been astronomical. Therefore, despite a long history of Christianity, there is an agreement that certain aspects of these churches inspire unique scholarly attention. Therefore, in the recently published Handbook of Megachurches, Michael Wilkinson can still get away with saying, large churches are historically new and somehow represent a transformation of congregational life. In many ways though, megachurches are no different from any other church. For example, that transformation cannot be measured in a change to core Christian beliefs, as megachurches tend not only to be theologically conservative, but also to reflect their denominational origins. Additionally, the field recognizes that although many megachurches are American, the largest megachurches are not. Still, other common themes are identified, the most important of which is that megachurches tend to be comfortable in the spiritual marketplace, where personal conviction and discipleship is of utmost importance. Megachurches also tend to be comfortable using marketing techniques that blend the spiritual and material in ways traditional Christianity eschewed. These are often called brands. Stephen Hunt suggests that brands offer landmarks for individual religious questing and open up communicative spaces for personal spiritual experiences and the formulation of what Peter Berger calls a sacred canopy. Religions are now forced to compete and to communicate with each other in the infinite space of a mass-mediated public sphere. This point is agreed upon by both sociologists and attendees. For example, my own MPhil reviewed the emergence of the Hillsong United brand via a discussion of Hillsong's branding, the band in discussion of the branding. Recently, Tom Wagner has developed this further with the notion of branding as sonic, or the Hillsong sound, which is featured in his monograph. Transforming into brand means megachurches to some extent can be in charge of the messaging around their own identity. The executive vice president of Hillsong College recently expressed to me a personal preference for the term Hillsong movement over Hillsong megachurch. Here I can only really guess at his reasons, but the megachurch's literature becomes very clear in its limits when discussing a brand with which people fluidly associate and disassociate. Hillsong's recently articulated mission or goal was to plant churches in 100 national locations. But of course, through a worship studies lens, Hillsong has long been holding church in more contexts than this, building influence through worship songs that were distributed first via tapes and CDs, then YouTube, and now full services hosted via its television station. In some senses, having these campuses authorizes the participation of people who already see Hillsong as their home church. From this perspective, it grants them a more formal relationship with the center via physical connection. And in this sense, the Hillsong movement is much more palatable to them. Nevertheless, there are two main reasons why I continue to engage the megachurch literature. Despite this perceived lack of relevance for attendees or insiders. The first one I've mentioned, which is a recognition of how technologies and technes influence the worship setting, a theme around which my research often runs. The interaction between an interiorized spirituality and an externalized performance is often highlighted in the megachurch literature more adequately than it is in the theological. Although the field of liturgy has made moves to include critical analysis, it is heavily stacked with established denominations and scholars who do not necessarily understand the auditorium or YouTube or the panopticon of social media. God bless these liturgists for it, because these priests, nuns, and liturgical specialists offer something completely different and even essential for an emerging megachurch scholar. The second reason I continue to engage in the megachurch literature is its potential to analyse the continuity and breaks between the church growth movement and megachurch organisational forms. The theological seminaries that hosted the church growth movement have, after fierce debate, long abandoned them. Missiology has decried and revisited its key metaphors. However, in the post-colonial context, church growth theories are still available in the local Christian bookshop. These are the ideas that pastors have access to in less educated movements, and I'm regularly approached by non-Western students who want to apply these ideas. It is important to note that the practice of megachurches is not merely growth. These organisations have, in fact, nuanced political economies and different public theologies. Therefore, I believe a more explicit discussion about them serves insider scholars. There needs to be a disciplinary space in which the idea of growth can be debated and discussed, evaluated and revised in light of contemporary economics, ecological issues, and megachurch practice and policies. The idea that any church, by virtue of its size alone, has an unthinking commitment to the theories of Donald McGavran or Peter Wagner or Charles Kraft should raise immediate suspicion from our peers in the academy. It doesn't, however, and this leads to the central idea around which this presentation is written. When the scholarly depiction of culture causes it to appear static or, as anthropologists say, reified, this challenges the researcher's powers. For this reason, James Clifford coined the well-used phrase, culture is contested, in 1986. He says this: if culture is not an object to be described, neither is it a unified corpus of symbols and meanings that can be definitively interpreted. Culture is contested, temporal and emergent. Representation and explanation, both by insiders and outsiders, is implicated in this emergence. The phrase is catchy enough to appeal to my megachurch branding sensibilities. So, in recognition of the unity, diversity, and of course, Hillsong's latest album release, I've called today's presentation, All of My Best Friends Remember Culture is Contested, mainly because it amuses me to do so. There's no real defense from my university colleagues. If you haven't seen the Young and Free video to which I'm referring, you may not get this reference. But I'm sure you can pause this video and open up a new window. Type in All of My Best Friends Hillsong. And you'll see a YouTube clip with thousands of views who are, of course, my best friends. That's kind of a joke. The song rings out, all of my best friends are sick of pretending, and the dance floor groans under the weight of thousands of youth. Yes, there are celebrities in this video, but mainly the power is to the people. We want the truth, we want it, they yell out before the band plays their first note. The megachurch literature will tell you that the act of engaging in megachurch worship is, such as this, is a drug, and one to which attendees are addicted, and perhaps that's true. However, if we return to Randall Collins' research into interaction ritual chains, which is the origin of this theory that researchers draw upon, the core of it is that people place meanings into symbols. This theory draws on Durkheim to show how worship can generate feelings of group solidarity or belonging, and also Irving Goffman's interaction rituals, which propose that everyday life is ritualized, even the smallest of conversations. This intersects well with the work of Pentecostal scholar Daniel Albrecht, who breaks Pentecostal rites down, analyzing their various emotional energies or sensibilities. In Collins' work, he describes emotional energy as a feeling of confidence, courage to take action, boldness in taking initiative. It is a morally suffused energy. It makes the individual feel not only good, but exalted with the sense of doing what is most important and most valuable. There's no doubt that the described emotional experience occurs in worship. But Collins posits that this energy is placed into symbols in various ways. Therefore, different social groups can perform solidarity by rehearsing their symbols. These are not universal. In investigation, it becomes clear how every single line of a worship song is littered with symbols. Therefore, watching a 22-year-old yell out, "All of the lights I chased are now faded," I know the beauty of this moment is its multivalence. In the 4 seconds it takes a megachurch attendee to sing this line, there will be different meanings assumed. For example, the megachurch pastor may read celebration, as in, "I've stopped attending the club and taking drugs." The small group leader may read solidarity to the institution, or "I'm 100% in for Jesus." The small group member may read the small group member may read actuation, as in, "We've together abandoned the pursuits that hinder our true self." Finally, the university peer may read this simultaneously as resistance, as in, "I've stopped using Pentecostal performance to structure my spirituality in non-authentic ways." Perhaps Pentecostals will laugh at me here, but evaluating meanings in such a simple random phrase like "all of the lights I chased are now faded" is a way to show precisely how culture is contested. It's also a way of thinking through what discipleship means to the various groups, their teleos or end goal. The insider knows that all of these meanings coexist, perhaps at the same time for the same person. In other words, the worship experience results in multiple solidarities. It is the multivalence of these symbols that makes them so powerful. This also explains the megachurch's flexibility in communicating simultaneously to different audiences. Ultimately, though, all grow the megachurch, which is the only interest of the current analysis. There's no doubt that leadership is important to this picture. However, this picture can also be read within a traditionally Christian lens of 1 Corinthians 12 as the different functions of the body. Interestingly, Christianity suggests that honor should be given to leaders, but power is a different thing. From the stage, the sight of such an energized crowd is not only intoxicating, it can be intimidating. They, the people, are participating in an event that threatens to shake the very fundamentals of Australian neo-Pentecostalism. They, the youth, are out of control and they are citing Bob Dylan. And yet, they, the youth, are at church. All of these people are my best friends. They are moving in particular, predictable ways. They know when to step back and to make enough room for the worship leader. And they are creating a video clip together to convey their message and to contribute to the economies of the megachurch. A megachurch pastor uses this type of video to argue that the church is alive. It challenges the very foundations of culture and youth experience. Indeed, that is true. Youth are here in the church. They are critiquing their reliance on smartphones and they are demonstrating how they satisfy their spiritual needs within the community rather than in the more individualistic spiritual marketplace of the boomers. However, the worship pastor has to have more awareness of these multiple messages. Their task or challenge is in the megachurch environment is harnessing this raw power for Christian spirituality, given the church's diverse individuals and collectives. Extending Collins' theory, the pastor and the worship leader are themselves symbols representative of the congregation. They unify groups who would often otherwise have little in common. Therefore, Collins claims, every dog will have its day is more accurately every day will have its dog. Incidents shape their incumbents, however momentary they may be. Encounters make their encountees. It is games that make sports heroes, politics that makes politicians into charismatic leaders. Similarly, it is the megachurch that makes megachurch pastors. In the late 90s, many Christian musicians expressed to me how conscious they were that their celebrity was constituted not by their talent or dedication, but by the people. Indeed, without the congregation, few megachurch worship leaders retain their star status. Even more horrifyingly, in the American evangelical world, if these symbols fail their purpose, the people will depose them and they will produce another. In Collins' interactional ritual theory, this is an illustration of the stock market of symbols that rise and fall, representing the emotional energy of the people placed into them. To summarize here, the megachurch literature acknowledges energy but doesn't follow to Collins's actual conclusions that symbols are used differently by different subgroups, or that there can be divergent views about any symbol. In the Hillsong case, there is extraordinary agreement between wildly different constituents about who should be on stage, why they should be there, and how this affects the corporate spirituality when they are. This strong agreement is often cited as proof of the church's homogeneity, but I believe it is evidence of its great diversity. This is true for the main campus, but it also includes smaller and global locations. Currently, concerns center around the interactions between increasingly diverse racial and ethnic identities that coexist at Hillsong. Through the prism of style, these were seen as preferences concerning worship. But in fact, the styles were always constitutive symbols of identity. To use Joel Robbins' categories, an attendee is continually assessing whether they will community build or revise the symbols, revise the symbols where necessary, or community break and abandon them. These choices have always been embedded or performed, but millennials are now making them more explicit and public via social media. This presentation seeks to normalize the plurality of megachurch experience and make explicit these continual choices before an attendee who participates in the structures so painstakingly described by researchers. I propose that these plural realities exist within every moment of the ritual. People are walking out of the auditorium on a high. Similarly, people are walking out of the auditorium who feel slapped in the face by a wet fish and who will stare at the wall for a week in order to process the events. Both experiences are narrated within the context of a spiritual journey that the attendee is on. This data is not often captured, nor is it recognized by most researchers. Pastors have an intuition about it, but energy is rarely openly discussed. In the Pentecostal context, it is articulated as positioning, which is also a symbol. The events are often explained in relation to intimacy with God, an alignment with various church leaders, who symbolize the collective in various ways. Positioning can represent very simple choices: to physically sit at the back of the auditorium, or to lean in and to share a scripture during an opportune moment in a meeting. It represents the intensity of energy held in a person's body during worship, and it is the relational glue that holds people together who disagree wildly on many various topics. In desperate need of a way to articulate life within a global Pentecostal megachurch, I'd like to bend the work of Nigerian-American researcher Nimiwara Boko to present a way of making this unspoken more explicit and relating it to this field. Nimiwara Boko has a range of books on Pentecostalism, but the one that deeply challenged how I engage in worship studies or congregational studies is The Charismatic City. I was asked to read this volume by Amos Young before we pitched our co-edited volume, The Hillsong Movement Examined, to Palgrave's series editors. I certainly did not expect to draw so heavily on this work. I assumed that the African context was entirely different to the Australian one across multiple dimensions. For example, in the Handbook of Megachurches, Richard Burgess describes Lagos, Nigeria, as having Pentecostal cities with not only auditoriums, but also housing estates, banks, supermarkets, health centres, and recreational facilities that can accommodate up to 1 million people. In contrast, Australian religion is discouraged in the public square, And I sense that permeation at the level of Christian banks is highly unlikely to become the norm here. In fact, when I read that the first time, I thought, oh great, 1 million people between me and the frozen chips in the frozen section of Coles. What has been incredibly helpful is his post-colonial framing that applies Paul Tillich to neo-Pentecostalism as a rhizomatic network in plural or intersecting versions. This text briefly proposes a simultaneous metropolis or hegemonic presence and a heteropolis or alternative one. For me, this made deep sense as in a dominant culture Australian Pentecostal megachurch, we have learnt to speak in new tongues via interaction with marginalised Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Pentecostal groups. I've previously highlighted how the flexibility of Pentecostalism's duality has allowed for the introduction of new liturgy that was borrowed from traditional Indigenous ritual moments, such as Acknowledgement of Country, which precedes now all of Australia's premier Pentecostal conferences. Such a moment brings together both the coloniser and the colonised into direct relationship within the bounds of a shared spirituality and associated practice. This illustrates how culture is contested in the megachurch, a diversity that plays out across many social, political, and economic fragmentations. This proposal that there is diversity within the Pentecostal megachurch should not surprise anyone. Pentecostal theologians cite the biblical narrative of Acts 2 as their central motif. In Jerusalem's upper room, diverse believers were gathered. At this original Pentecost event, tongues of fire were said to rest on each worshipper's head, with a sign of glossolalia or heavenly languages, marking the age of the Spirit and inauguration of the church. Frank Macchia locates this practice's retrieval and the continuing importance upon tongues for Pentecostals as sacrament, a sign of God's unmediated presence that empowers the believer for Christian life and witness. Speaking in tongues became a distinctive of Pentecostal practice, accompanied by ecstatic experience in worship and in prayer. Jamie Smith proposes that this speech act produces a new social imaginary, as tongue speech is the language of communities of resistance who seek to defy the powers that be. My proposal is that the powers that be and the powers that yet to be both exist in megachurch worship space. Finally, in closing, the sheer diversity of megachurch is illustrated here at this conference in several notable emerging attendees' presentations. The plenary sessions are a collection of excellent scholars engaged with the megachurch. I want to encourage young insider scholars that you are building the nodes from which future research will take place. The topics you're covering in megachurch worship and ritual, culture and discipleship are significant in understanding how religion operates in adherents' lives. Perhaps you will not hear this much, but I see you. Christians always initiate change with this dedicated small group who long to see something more and who actuate towards this vision. I recently read an article in the Guardian about a tiny group of British churches that were reinvigorating Gaelic psalm singing. Something within it resonated. The author stated, "It begins with the presenter, a leader, singing the opening lines of a psalm to a church congregation who then drift in. Each person decorates the tune individually, driven by their own tempo and rhythm, for everyone returns together to the same note. Imagine the sonic equivalent of a murmuration of starlings." This imagery of a murmuration has been used to great effect by Global Senior Pastor Bobby Houston to describe worshippers at Hillsong Church. This description provides a good analogy of how emotional energy is shared. Should one observe a gathering or a murmuration of scholars of faith, seen here extending the megachurch literature, the individual's contribution to the whole should be acknowledged even as they converge into the broader sky. While there is unquestioningly a place for skepticism and doubt, there is also hope and belief. There is room for heterophony, because in the words of James Clifford, culture is contested and it is also emergent. Thank you.